Hello, everyone, and thanks very much to those who are tuning in. We are about less than 24 hours from when polls closed on Election Day in the United States. And what we've seen on Facebook and its impact on both Election Day and what we can expect from the next few days is, of course, extremely important. We've brought together a great group of experts in this area, and they're going to talk us through some of the really quite shocking examples that they saw. So I'm going to first introduce Shireen Mitchell, who is on our Brains Trust and also the founder of Stop Online Violence Against Women. Shireen, thanks for making time today in the hectic period right after the election day. Tell us about what you were seeing. I'm going to go ahead and pull up some slides of your examples.
Yeah. So the slides that come up are going to be about Philly, but I'll just say overall what we saw was different aspects of what was going on all day yesterday, but things that were sort of a through line from what we've been monitoring for at least a week or so. So one example will be the way in which we were watching disinformation that was being presented. For example, for those that remember the Biden bus that was being harassed, like we watched the messaging in between that in the way in which people were trying to show an image of a white car, saying that the white car was the one doing something wrong. And even though that's not in the slide right now, I just want to use that as one example as we're about to go into the Philadelphia conversation, where the manipulation was being presented, that somehow these citizens were being helpful to the Biden bus, which wasn't true. When you watch the whole video, you see what it is. But the most important part was that the person in the black truck actually said on Facebook that he basically was the one harassing and going after the white car. So, and he didn't, and he also had a record. This follows through to the same type of behavior that we saw in Philadelphia, where the information being presented is being manipulated. So the slides that you see in front of you is someone who actually was working for the Trump campaign, going around and also tweeting, but also going around grabbing content and basically saying there's a problem in Philly, and started this whole uproar about like the basically a hashtag stop the steal. That was just one example. It went from Twitter and transferred over to Facebook. We saw the exact same thing with the exact same images that you are seeing here and presented. Even though Philadelphia's DA, if you see to the right there, Kyle, where it says members of our election task force have handled this, that one there, basically commenting on the tweet next to it to let people know that this was inaccurate. But that did not stop this person from pushing this content out. And by the way, we had several groups of people reporting it, and no one, Twitter, for example, did not take that down. We did not see takedowns on Facebook. And so we saw that the ways in which, as we're going to debate right now about Philadelphia, as we've seen this morning, having the Secretary of State and others talk about what's going on and how they're going to count, was that they were using that content to basically say that this is, Philadelphia trying to cheat. When in actuality, what we've seen is the ways in which that is a target specifically on the Black vote. The fact that he was targeting Philadelphia says everything about still targeting Black voters when it comes to this type of digital voter suppression. And it's the perfect example for us to just show you how this takes place and then how it starts to elevate and escalate, where now people will question whatever comes out of Philadelphia.
But I was seeing some of those
that we're trying to counter these narratives.
And I was just seeing some of those viewing statistics were in the millions on some of those pieces of content.
Yes, and shared across platform. And so for us, we were watching this and monitoring this. This is another city that we were working in and working with groups on the ground. And so to see the messaging against them as they were trying to get out the vote is a key piece here. I think that people don't understand. It's like the people who are trying to get out the vote are the ones being targeted. And even with violence and incitement to violence, and then these false narratives against them, the actions that they're taking, trying to, even the poll watcher example, where this guy was basically not given permission to come, because poll watching, you have to have that in your own region. This has been said over and over again. When you're outside your region, you do not have the right to come into another poll. And so that was clear in that video, but they were using that video to say that people were trying to steal it and watchers were not being able to get in. And those watchers were being used to harass. And again, these are key aspects of targeting specific groups. And if you look at the poll watcher video, you see Black poll workers are the ones who are saying you do not have the right here. And they're using that again against Black voters and those who are trying to get out the vote and protect the vote.
And we're not going to show the actual video because we don't want to support.
No. Don't show that video. I'm just saying.
But I think I understand. I'm just explaining to people why. I imagine some people will be like, "Well, just show me the video."
No.
It's really important not to amplify these things.
Exactly.
Thank you, Shireen.
Exactly.
We'll come back.
And also, just be clear: those who are trying to do rallies for Protect the Vote were also told not to come out, and this is really important because they were also being threatened that if they were showing aspects and areas of where they were going to go to get out the vote and rally for Protect the Vote, like Souls to the Polls and others, that they were also being told that they should not do that because of the incitement of violence against them showing up, trying to get people out to vote. And we need to understand what that means and how this was more acceptable.
And we'll come back, Shireen, on the bigger picture as well. I want to turn to Jessica Gonzalez, who is the co-CEO of Free Press. Jessica, over to you. I'll pull up your slide now.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Good morning from here in Los Angeles. Listen, just to zoom out for a moment, the President of the United States went on live television last night and claimed falsely that he had won the election while there were many votes still being counted. He was swiftly fact-checked on that by most major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, and even Chris Wallace from Fox News said, no, the votes are actually still being counted. As we saw, he then took to Facebook and Twitter to continue to seed misinformation such as, mail-in ballots are unreliable, that there was voter fraud going on, that there was essentially something untoward happening on the part of the Democratic Party as
only against him.
Yeah, as a number of states continue to just simply try to finish counting the votes that they've received. So Free Press is out this morning calling for Facebook and Twitter to take down all false or misleading election misinformation. We've tracked a bit. The slide you see here, you can see the difference in how Facebook and Twitter flag these posts. Facebook's language is very vague. It might lead one. This is an interstitial that they're putting up on nearly every post that mentions the election. Twitter is a bit more pointed. They actually note that some or all of the content shared in this tweet is disputed and might be misleading about an election or other civic information. Certainly Facebook at a minimum needs to put much stronger warnings. I think because—
And I note that, I just want to point out something quickly before I take the slide down. I note that engagement is disabled as well on the tweet, whereas even with the little thing on Facebook, people can still seem to comment and share. And this one here was, at the time you pulled the screenshot, had already been shared 44,000 times and had a total of 449,000 engagements and interactions.
That's right. That's right. So I'm not saying Twitter's perfect. I actually think because of the repeated misinformation coming out of the campaign and from campaign surrogates, that all posts that spread false or misleading information about elections should be taken down altogether. This is not much different from what we at Real Facebook Oversight Board and many other organizations have been calling for many months now, making sure that election disinformation is taken down. As we move into a continuingly uncertain period, I want to stress that it's still incredibly important that Facebook enforce its rules, that it amp up enforcement against people who are organizing violence on the platform. This is the Trump strategy, is to sow chaos, to stir up disinformation, and to organize over social media people to turn out and threaten, harass, and in some cases even commit violence. So it's incredibly important they take down threats of violence, organizing for violence, disinformation about the election. This is a very volatile period and it needs to be addressed swiftly. I'll just end and note, I met with some Facebook officials on Friday with a group of folks who are very concerned about Spanish language disinformation. We showed them a couple of posts that spread not just disinformation about the election, but actually were calls to arms in Spanish. They took one down, left another up, and then asked us as advocates at civil rights and racial justice groups to do their homework for them. It's incredibly important that they have adequate staff to deal with disinformation and hate in all the languages that people use on Facebook, but particularly in Spanish. It's the second most spoken language in the US, the fourth most spoken language in the world. There's just really no excuse for this incompetence.
And as you say, it shouldn't be up to NGOs and campaigning groups to be doing the job of a multi-$100 billion plus corporation. I just wanted to ask you one more question before we move to Laura. I was, as someone who's also very involved in politics, I remember the year 2000 where there was a period of uncertainty. And that period actually lasted until the 12th of December when the Supreme Court made their decision. And yet now we're in a situation where every day feels like that entire period of time. What has fueled, I mean, it's sort of a rhetorical question, but what is different? And why is it more dangerous now? Why is it so just gripping every second as opposed to 2000 where everyone just sort of waited for 5 weeks?
I mean, I think the fact that the disinformation is being spread by the President of the United States is one chief difference, though, I think we also have to look at the use of social media to spread disinformation, and not just to spread disinformation and hate, but to actually target people based on their demographic data. Knowing what kind of messages they may be susceptible to is a particularly troubling aspect that wasn't around for the 2000 elections. But look, I have to say, we did not have a great media environment in 2000. We have over-relied on corporate media to out the truth, to serve justice. Corporate media failed us in that period. Corporate media is failing us now. We cannot have a solely corporate media system if we want to be able to hold the powerful accountable. I think that's what we're seeing. It's not working in big tech. It hasn't worked in some of our major news networks. And so this is an ecosystem that we need to be looking at holistically. Social media is part of the problem. It's not the only problem. Here in the United States, we've lost half of our local journalists in the past 12 years. And so we have to be looking at this in a very holistic way. Why is disinformation being allowed to spread like this? And are we missing, and I think we are, many of the important checks and balances, the field of journalists who are really digging in and doing the important work of telling the truth.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, I'm going to turn to Laura Edelson now, who is a cybersecurity researcher with NYU's adobservatory.org. Laura, I'll go ahead and pull up your slide. What are you seeing?
So this morning, we found some interesting data that was certainly not consistent with what we were expecting. We were seeing that there appeared to still be active ads running on Facebook. We were able to ascertain, though, that this was not a reflection of what was actually being shown to Facebook users. For Facebook users, the political ad ban went into effect at midnight Pacific time on election night, just as Facebook said it would. The problem was, however, that Facebook's ad library was making it look like that wasn't the case. So we were able later in the morning to get some clarity that there's apparently up to a 24-hour delay in data and how data gets reported to the ad library. So while this morning it said that this ad was still active, it apparently had actually been taken down at midnight. So we certainly congratulate Facebook on being able to implement this ban, but the confusion here was really, really hard to deal with. I think I and a lot of other folks are very concerned about this post-election period and monitoring advertiser behavior. And so the fact that we have had to spend so much time just trying to verify this was just really tough, and certainly calls into question, the degree to which we can trust data coming out of the ad library.
And has that cease and desist that Facebook sent you, has that impacted your ability to do this work in the post-election period that is so crucial?
Well, probably spend more time talking to lawyers than I'd like to, but I will say that events like this really do illustrate the value to us of our Ad Observer browser extension project. Because the reason that I'm so confident saying, yes, this political ad ban did actually take effect, even though the ad library from Facebook seems to indicate that it didn't. The reason I feel like I can say that really confidently is that we do have this third-party source of data. So because we are monitoring ads that were seen by our browser extension users, I know that none of those users have seen a US political ad since midnight Pacific time, which is great. But certainly, sorry.
I was going to say, have you stopped using your tool, or are you still using it?
We're still using it. We will not be
Thank
complying
goodness.
with the cease and desist letter.
Thanks so much, Laura. All right, I'm going to move to Fadi now, who's the campaign director, who is a senior campaign director at Avaaz. Let me pull up your slide, and why don't you tell us what you were seeing?
Thank you, Kyle. And it's good to be with everyone here, especially, I'm sure it was a long night for the majority of people. Where I want to begin is the story actually is not just election day, but the days leading up to election day. And just a reminder that Facebook allowed millions of Americans to be saturated with misinformation. One of our key findings was just a week before elections, a manipulated video of presidential candidate Joe Biden where it's made to seem as if he's claiming the most extensive voter fraud operation in US history went viral across Facebook. It was viewed, in our estimates, over 20 million times. And the danger didn't end there. As we moved into election day, what we began seeing is a lot of content, certain irregularities, simple things oftentimes that happen in most elections were blown out of proportion. So certain claims such as some machines being broken and taking some time to be fixed were framed as stealing the vote. And we saw, for example, for just one claim, one term, Philly steal, the idea that the vote was being stolen in Philadelphia, that on Facebook, using CrowdTangle, had garnered over 27,000 interactions. And we saw something also new, which we like to call kind of distributed disinformation. So it wasn't one post that went viral that contained misinformation about election fraud. You had thousands or hundreds of posts in different localities, very locally targeted, that would gain a few thousands of views. But if you put them together, it gives you a huge, massive sign that too many Americans were showing this lie that voter fraud is happening. And then what was more dangerous is we then saw calls or claims that a coup was happening, with then calls for violence. So certain actors would put out claims saying that there are plans from, let's say, Antifa to destroy certain cities, or that they were planning to set certain public institutions on fire, and that people should begin preparing for that because it was part of planned violence that's going to happen across the US. And the danger there, we all remember Facebook belatedly took down QAnon, for example, and other militia groups that were organizing on the platform, but it allowed the ideology to seep in, and there are millions of followers of these different militia groups that are still on the platform. And so on that content that began to go viral, pushing towards violence, we then began seeing comments, kill them, shoot them, it's time we wipe them out. And another thing that we saw that really worried us was misinformation targeting the Spanish-speaking community, particularly in Florida, but across swing states. So we saw one video, for example, that had gone viral, and that video claimed that the vice presidential candidate, again, Joe Biden, was supporting pedophilia. We saw claims going viral claiming that Kamala Harris was a communist and had a plan for a socialist communist revolution across the US, or that leading drug dealers across Latin America who have committed violence were supporting her and were endorsing this campaign, and that was amplified to too many voters on this day. So if you put those stories together, they kind of build up towards election of this claim of voter fraud, priming people consistently with the idea that the election was going to be stolen. And then you see the calls to violence, and then you see these claims. You can begin to see the type of narrative that I think is scaring a lot of us monitoring this information across the US, which is people are being put in this black box of fear and outrage. And the true threat, I believe, to our democracy is not voter fraud, but is actually this disinformation that's being fueled by the algorithms of these platforms.
And what number of people would you estimate? Have you made an estimation of how many people likely saw one of these false or misleading claims? Is it in the millions?
Well, the problem here again is the lack of transparency with Facebook in particular. They haven't allowed an audit, and they share positive numbers, like they've helped millions of people register to vote. They don't share how many people that voter suppression misinformation has reached and have not gone out to vote or have been influenced by these operations. But we tried to estimate this, Kyle. We ran a survey a couple of weeks before the elections, and for registered voters that were on the internet, over 65% had said that they had seen at least one misinformation claim on Facebook. And so if you extrapolate that number, we're talking tens of millions of Americans have seen this type of misinformation narrative. And none of them, to a very large extent, none of them have ever been informed by Facebook that they were targeted with this content or received corrections to this content. And it's really scary. It's a democratic emergency where we are right now.
My God. Okay. I want to turn to Roger McNamee, who is the author of Zucked and a former mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. Roger, I know you just had a power outage and you jumped back on your phone, I imagine. So thank you very much for that speed. I just, okay, we've heard this stuff. What does it mean for the foreseeable? What's at risk here?
So from Facebook's point of view, they really believe that they had a good day yesterday. That their public relations effort of attempting to prevent new disinformation from happening has convinced enough people in journalism that I think they feel like they're getting away with this election. The real reality of it is the outcome is very favorable. If you're trying to prevent regulation, which is clearly Facebook's top priority right now, divided government favors Facebook enormously. And I think that when we do the postmortem, we're going to look back and realize that nearly half of America lives in an alternative universe where there's a completely different set of facts, and that Facebook is largely responsible for that they're not the only ones, but they have been by far the most important force. And the notion that we could have had a pandemic that has not just killed 230,000 Americans in less than a year, but it has been the single worst cause of death in terms of the number of deaths in the shortest period of time in the history of the country, greater than any war, greater than any natural disaster. And the notion that given how much of that was the result of bad decisions made by the Trump administration, it is astonishing that Trump could have gotten more votes in this election than he did in 2016. And I think completely the result of the successful use of internet platforms, but primarily for Facebook, to both create an alternative reality and maintain it. Two active supporters of QAnon got elected to the House of Representatives, at least two. And, that Facebook has admitted that there were more than 3 million people in Facebook pages and groups devoted to QAnon. And their own internal studies say that 64% of the time when a person joins an extremist group on Facebook, it's because Facebook recommended it, which means that 2 million of that 3 million wound up in QAnon because of Facebook. And so I think we're in this horrible situation this morning where, you know, the politics of America are broken, and we may wind up getting an election outcome that in fact does count all the ballots. That would be huge progress, but we're not going to have a situation in terms of electoral politics in the United States where we're allowed to have reasoned debates. There's a great risk of complete paralysis, which would be, you know, at this moment in time with the pandemic still raging, just enormously tragic.
I mean, that sort of brings me to my big question. Jessica, I want to pose it to you first. Also, if we have a few journalists in, if Patience from the Wall Street Journal can just type in the chat to Carol, so we know your question, and then we have another question from Arturo. But before we get to those, Jessica, what is the number one, and if you have it, number two thing that Facebook needs to get right in the next 24 hours, week, you know, what do they have to do?
Well, listen, we know what's going to happen. Steve Bannon said this out loud, right? It's not a conspiracy. Flood the zone with shit, right? That is the strategy. Excuse my language, but that's an exact quote. The number one and two things that Facebook, I mean, I have plans for them in the long term, but in the next week, they need to absolutely make sure that their platform is not being used to organize, foment, or legitimize violence. Number two, they absolutely need to take down, not just flag with a weak interstitial, take down disinformation about our democracy. We're on the brink here. We're actually testing the democratic experiment. It may or may not pan out. And these are two critically important things that Facebook must get right. They haven't gotten right up to now, and the time is now.
Yeah, absolutely now. I want to see from everyone else, you know, what are the greatest dangers around the same lines? Can we start with Shireen? You're on mute, Shireen.
Yes.
What's the most important thing that Facebook needs to do?
I think that we need to really deal with something that we haven't been talking about here, and that is the way in which Facebook has made it seem like it's an even playing field between those who are trying to get out the vote and get people out to the polls versus what politicians and those who are producing ads to win their candidacy in any form. And I don't care which office that is. And we haven't seen the same responses to those who have been shut down, because one of the things about their political ads is that they will basically stop nonprofits, organizations, entities that are trying to get people out to vote, sharing information with them, and call that political and add that into the context depending on what the words are. So what we did see, including our organization, was the way in which we were targeted. We were targeted to have no more ads as of September 30th. And that date coincides when we participated in the announcement of this oversight board, and that there's a difference in the way that they handle certain people's right to, to free speech on their platforms. And this was something we had monitored for quite some time about the ways in which our ads were being treated when we had our first announcement of the campaign to stop digital voter suppression. We were basically stopped in expanding that across their platform. That was the one thing that they were making sure wasn't getting the same viewership against the things that we're talking about in terms of politicians and all this disinformation. We were trying to stop that disinformation. And so if we don't understand the differences there, we are fundamentally not going to solve this problem. The way that they approach this is that this somehow is equal power dynamics. And it's not. And
Mhm.
it's very much an issue that we have not faced. And this goes all the way back to the moderation process, that if Black and brown people are speaking up about the harms against them, that they're the ones that are problematic. And those who are trying to stop the digital voter suppression on their platforms are the ones that are problematic, not the people who are committing these violations. And to compare them as if they're equal in any form already tells you what Facebook is doing and how they view us, and why we need to have more people understand what needs to be done here. It's not just us in terms of nonprofits and civil rights organizations trying to change what these outcomes are in terms of how we are viewed. It is the way in which we're sort of considered equal to those who are already in power, and
Mm.
those who are given more elevation through these political ads. And I think Laura's work really speaks volumes to this, because if we can't look at and understand how these ads are being managed, that transparency, we can't answer this and hold them accountable. And I think that's their position. They don't want to be held accountable.
Thank you, Shireen. I mean, it's all about, pushing accountability away, isn't it? Laura, can we have a few journalist questions, but I want to ask you, Laura, really quickly. I'm not sure if you'll have an answer for this, but what are you seeing with ads from third parties, news organizations, for example? Is that something in the remit, or?
Yes, it is. So in terms of what I am most worried about over the next few days to a week, it's definitely ads from news publishers. So as I'm sure most people on this call know, news publishers have an exemption from the requirements for disclosure and transparency of political ads. And when that loophole was announced in April of 2019, we definitely saw an uptick of partisan actors who saw this for the loophole that it is and created organizations almost specifically to exploit it. So right now, until the political ad ban on, for other political advertisers is lifted, the only partisan actors who are allowed to run disclosed political ads are these partisan news outlets who have obtained this exemption. So right now, they're the category of advertiser that I'm personally most concerned about, and we're spending the most time monitoring. Frankly, that's what I'm going to be spending a lot of my today doing. A lot of that stuff is just starting to pop up now, and we're going to work on making sure that, one, we can quantify it for our ongoing research, and two, that we have some monitoring in place so that if those advertisers are spreading harmful or misinformative content, we can raise the alarm.
And how many of these sort of air quotes news organizations are there, and sort of what's the scale of their reach?
So I'm a computer scientist, not a political scientist, so it's difficult for me to give you to really say where should the set point be on what is a news provider and what is a news provider. But in total we monitor about 4,000 news organizations that are based or active in the United States, and about 1,000 of those come from a list that those great folks over at Columbia put together of what they call pink slime news providers that I think they would categorize as falling into this extremely partisan actor category. There's definitely a lot in between, right? There are real news sources that have a very strong partisan bend, but we're not set up solely to take advantage of this exemption. And I'm not really including those. That 1,000 is really just the sort of worst of the worst, we'll say.
So in short, the reach is huge.
So it's hard to say because these advertisers, right. So these are advertisers that have been exempted from both disclosure to users and also transparency. So the only way that we can get a feel for their reach is by looking at the data that gets reported through CrowdTangle for their organic engagement. But it's difficult for me to say how much money they've spent on advertising or how many impressions they've had on ads, because Facebook doesn't make that data transparent.
Okay, thank you. Fidi, can I just ask you before that we have a question from Arturo Garcia, but just before, can I ask you sort of just the same question, more from the political campaigning angle, the impact of these pseudo news organizations from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And one thing that we had seen are super PACs creating these pseudo news organizations that they claim are real, and then they advertise these kind of pages. Everyone probably remembers the Macedonian or Russian fake news pages that were sharing misinformation. They weren't real news websites, but they looked real. And we found at least a couple of super PACs that during this election had used the same strategy. They created different, what they claim to be news sources, news sites, and then they pushed them, targeted them, micro-targeted them at voters in swing states in Florida, Wisconsin, and elsewhere. And they, not just that, they violated Facebook's policies by sharing misinformation that had been fact-checked by Facebook's partners multiple times, and Facebook did not take action. Some of them had promised that they're going to be spending $22 million on Facebook, and they actually spent them, or the majority of them, without significant action from the platform. And what does that mean in numbers? Well, the ads that we saw had reached about 10 million impressions in swing states. And that was just one batch. There were over 500 different iterations of those ads. But there was something new as well that we saw yesterday specifically, Kyle, which was a lot of these pseudo websites and a lot of these different organizations on Instagram and on Facebook actually had live war rooms. So these were, or they used stories, and they began sharing their misinformation using those rooms, and they had already built a lot of followers based on targeting users. And so they were sharing misinformation live. That, a lot of that won't be documented because these stories disappear, the Instagram stories disappear, the live videos, they can take them down afterwards, and nobody's going to watch hours of footage to see when they shared misinformation in that hours of footage. But there were tens of thousands of Americans watching those videos, being saturated with that content. And it's just another layer of disinformation that is putting our democracy at risk, and the platforms are barely doing anything about it.
And part of the struggle with the scale, I imagine, is because it's so disparate. So it accumulates quickly. Okay, I just want to Arturo Garcia, if you want to turn your camera and microphone on and pose your question.
Just my audio. Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Are you able to turn your camera on?
Yeah, but it's 80 degrees and on the top of a hill in California, so no. I'm
okay.
I'm a fact checker, and I used to work for a site that was part of Facebook's fact checking partnership. So a lot of this information, frankly, is not new, but I appreciate it. There's little chance of Mark Zuckerberg and his allies wanting or listening to accountability. So my question to you, excuse me, to you is, what are you groups going to do as far as pressuring lawmakers to increase oversight against the platform?
Okay, so this is the pressure. Roger, do you want to start on that, actually? You're muted, Roger.
So there's been a really big change in the past few months in the United States on Capitol Hill. The Democrats who run both the House Antitrust Subcommittee and the House Consumer Protection Subcommittee have built staffs that really, I think, are legitimately expert in the fields that they're attempting to regulate. And I think a process has begun there that will continue going forward with the House as long as the Democrats maintain control. If the Republicans have control of the Senate, that's going to make progress very difficult, except in the narrow areas where there is at least overlap in views. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act has become a place where at least some Republicans are open to amendment. And I think there is some real interest, particularly among Republicans in the House, in antitrust regulation. But I do think that the outcome of this election does not bode well for huge pressure at the federal level. I think the big pressure is going to come from states. I think the antitrust and consumer protection cases against Google and Facebook, respectively, that are being run by state attorneys general in the United States, those are going to be moving forward, and I think probably with renewed vigor based on what's happened in this election. I would also call your attention, the state of California, a ballot proposition, Proposition 24, passed that greatly increases the rules and the protections to consumers under the California Computer Privacy Act. And that is a big step forward. It's far from perfect, but I think the pressure will continue. But I believe that legitimately this election is likely to leave us with fewer tools than I would have liked, but hopefully enough tools to effect some change.
Thanks, Roger. Does anyone else want to add from there? Go for it, Jessica.
I can weigh in. We've been working on this a bit at Free Press, or quite a bit more than a bit. I think Roger's generally right. I mean, we'll see how the votes line up once they're all in. But I think if we are actually talking about what needs to happen, which I think we should talk about regardless of the election outcomes, we need to look at our ad disclosure laws. Broadcast law has some really strict and important rules requiring disclosure of who's placing ads. I think we need to look at that in the online context as well. We need to bring a lot more transparency and accountability to that process. Certainly, we should be talking about data privacy law at the federal level. We need to make sure that our private data is not being used to undermine civil rights. So Free Press has a piece of model legislation that we put out into the world with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law that we think is a critical step to protecting privacy and civil rights online. And frankly, I think we need to look as well, in addition to some of what Roger mentioned, we need to be looking at tax law. These companies are extracting far more from US people than they are giving back. And they're making money hand over fist. We need to be looking at how we can harness, make them pay their fair share in taxes, and redistribute that money to support independent local journalism. That is another way to fight the disinformation problem that we're facing here.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I know everyone has a lot to do. It's busy on election day, so we may come back later with what we see. But I want to close there. Just ask Jessica before we go. Jessica, do you have your next meeting with Facebook on the books yet?
Not yet. I emailed them this morning asking them to take down all of the election disinformation that remains up, noting that Twitter had a better interstitial that was more informative on the tweets from the Trump campaign and their surrogates. I don't have another meeting scheduled. We just met on Friday. I think we need to see what shakes out here as we're all focused on protecting the election results first and foremost, making sure that all the votes get counted.
And Kyle,
all right, thanks, Jessica.
Kyle, before
go
we
ahead,
go,
Shereen.
yeah, just one other thing in terms of what laws are. This is something that we've been trying to look at, and we've had conversations with the Lawyers Committee as well. There are only 3 states that have something that could protect the digital voter suppression in any way, and they have aspects of that we have not implemented or used yet, and we need to expand that across the nation. And so I think it's important for us to start thinking about other ways that we can do that on the state level, not necessarily a federal level, and expand that across the board. And so that's one of the things that we're focused on in terms of for people to understand that this is the kind of thing that we are looking to go moving forward at this point as well.
All right, thanks, Shereen. And that's a huge part of this big debate, isn't it?
Yes, I mean,
okay.
Without that, we have no protections, in my opinion, the way we should.
Exactly, as you called it, the technological version of Jim Crow. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap there. Everybody get back to what you were doing. On Tinderhooks, just update, the Trump campaign has called for a recount in Wisconsin, so we know that will now be starting, so it could be a delay. It was within 1%. All right, we're gonna get clips ready and out so people can consume this and learn from it. Thank you all very much. Have a good day, and we'll be back to you as soon as we can. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.